football and accessible workplace. So I'd like to welcome first Esther Jones-Russell, who is our Eastern European Development Officer, onto the stage.
Hi, thank you very much. Sorry, I'll just wait while our other guests come on the stage. Thank you. Perfect. So, in the last day and a half, we've heard a lot about the works of CAFE and our partners in improving the matchday accessibility for disabled fans. But it's really important that disabled people can get involved in football at every level, including, as Robin touched upon earlier, in employment. And that can be as volunteers, as support staff, or as leaders and decision makers. CAFE is looking to develop our work in this area, and we're creating guidance documents for footballing stakeholders so that they can improve their recruitment and retention of disabled people. So we're incredibly excited to host this session on the topic. The title of this session, Football and Accessible Workplace, has a question mark at the end of it because it raises a number of important questions. Is football an inclusive sphere of employment? If not, why not? Can football ever be an accessible workplace? Are the two things compatible? And what can we do so that the next CAFE conference, we can have a session with the same title but without a question mark? In other words, how can we achieve inclusive employment so that at the next CAFE conference we can be celebrating the many success stories within the sport? I'm delighted to introduce our panellists for the session, who I know will help in answering these questions and many more. First, Diane Lightfoot, CEO of the Business Disability Forum, will present some statistics about disability in employment and provide advice on how we can improve recruitment and retention of disabled employees. Then José Suarez will talk us through the Football for All leadership programme, which he created with the aim of training and upskilling disabled people as a platform to pursue careers in football. There's been a slight change to the agenda. Unfortunately, neither Sergei Afanasenko or Jamie Dorwood were able to attend the conference. However, Jamie has provided us with a fantastic video which showcases all the great work they're doing at Bradford City with their inclusive volunteer programme. And CAFE's very own Amy Wilson has kindly agreed to step in at the last minute to explain about her own experiences as a disabled employee in football. So to get us started, I'd like to welcome Diane Lightfoot to the stand.
Thank you very much, Esther, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. When I told people I had this speaking gig in Bilbao at the stadium, everybody was really terribly jealous at work, so thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my organisation, Business Disability Forum, a few kind of facts and figures about disability in Europe and some UK-specific stats as well, and then some sort of practical hints and tips on how any business, but including football clubs and football associations, can get better at recruiting and retaining disabled employees. So we are a UK-based not-for-profit. We aim to make it easier for businesses of all shapes and sizes to get better at recruiting and retaining disabled employees and also serving disabled customers. We've been going for actually now nearly 28 years and were set up originally to lobby for what became the first meaningful bit of disability legislation in the UK, the Disability Discrimination Act. But ultimately, I always say that what we are here for is to transform the life chances of disabled people as employees and as consumers. And that's a subject dear to my heart. I've only been in post at Business Disability Forum for just under 2 years, but before that I spent 13 years at a charity working primarily with people with learning disabilities, autism and profound and enduring mental health conditions. And I've seen firsthand just how getting a job for the first time, perhaps in somebody's 20s, 30s, 40s or beyond, can completely transform their lives, their identity, their social network, let alone their income. So it's very, very important. And I'm here to tell you as well that employing disabled people isn't just the right thing to do, though clearly it is. It's also good for your business. As a bit of context about who we are, I put a few of our global members there on the screen. But we are also working with a lot of smaller organisations now and are currently developing a membership package for smaller organisations specifically. And we've branched out across sort of different sectors, universities, education, local government, central government. So it's really, really very broad. And of course, we are delighted to welcome CAFE as one of our newer members this year. So when we talk about disability, and when I'm talking about disability in this presentation, who am I talking about? So a few facts and figures. So more than 1 billion people in the world today experience a disability. So that's 15% of the world's population. Thinking about our membership, 45% of our members operate globally, whether that is across Europe or in specific overseas markets or completely global, like someone like HSBC. Collectively, we estimate they employ 8 million people worldwide. Some European specific figures. 70 million people in the EU27, aged 15 and over, have a disability, and that's 17.6% of the population, which is very close to the figure we use in the UK, which is 18%. My next slide, I'm delighted it's exactly the same as Robin's. 83% of disabilities are acquired, and I understand that the average age of acquiring a disability is 53. Also, as Robin said, over 90% of disabilities are not visible. So my message really is you are almost certainly already working with and employing many more disabled people than you think you are. Back to the business case, we also know that diverse teams perform better. And EY, formerly Ernst & Young, is one of our members. And they carried out a bit of research within their own organisation, and they proved that the diverse teams performed better, so actually contributed more to the business's bottom line, were more profitable. And also, Robin has mentioned the spending power of disabled people. And although this presentation is really about employment, that's very important as well. And here's an EU stat, 61% of people with disabilities in the EU27 said that their disability restricted their participation in leisure pursuits. So what do we do? Well, I mentioned we have members, and the first thing to say really is that we are very pragmatic and very practical in the support that we provide. And we aim to show that employing disabled people doesn't have to be difficult, it doesn't have to be costly, and there are some really very simple things you can do to access a broad talent pool, and I'll come on to that. So we have an advice service, we have training courses, we have lots of resources, and we also feed into government policy in the UK. But the thing I really want to emphasise on this slide is our disability standard. It's an accreditation tool, and it reflects the fact that we believe that getting it right for disabled people needs a whole organisation approach. And my next slide, there we go, is split into 10 different areas with an icon for each, and it shows the 10 different areas we measure across our disability standard. And this is really trying to get the message across that disability is not just the domain of human resources or diversity and inclusion teams, or even, as is sometimes the case, though less so, corporate social responsibility. To get it right, it's got to be mainstreamed right across the piece. So just to say what the 10 areas of standard are, the first one is commitment, which is about senior level leadership and public commitment to getting it right for disabled people. The second is know-how, and that's about the confidence of local managers to support disabled employees. I'll say a tiny bit more about that in a minute. Third is adjustments, which I'll also talk about. So adjustments for people to mean that they can do the job, get to the interview, all those sorts of things. 4 and 5 are recruitment and retention, fairly self-explanatory. 6 is products and services, which of course is the customer piece, which we've talked about a lot over the course of this conference, and it's fantastic to hear all the stuff that is happening. The 7th one is suppliers and partners, and that's one that often gets overlooked, but that's really about if you're a business that is procuring any services on your behalf, those companies are reflecting you. So what can you do to make sure that they too reflect your values and support disabled people? 8 is communications, 9 is premises, which is, of course, absolutely vital in terms of access. And the last, but by no means least one, the 10th is ICT. And I really enjoyed Robin's presentation and got a lot from it. I'm also reflecting back on when I did a marketing qualification back in 1995. We talked about this thing called the internet, and we all said, it will never catch on. That's actually true, but there you go. It shows what we know. So that's the kind of framework we operate in. And more recently, because that's a UK-based tool, we have launched a global version of the Business Disability Framework, which aims to be a really practical tool as a self-assessment maturity model to help organisations measure where they are and identify targets to improve. And they can be, again, really simple things. So Esther asked me to talk about some of the barriers and what you can do about them. The first thing I want to say before this, before I get into the detail, is actually you may be thinking that as smaller organisations, you don't have the resources of the likes of Shell and HSBC and Barclays and etc. And that's absolutely true. However, smaller organisations are often able to be more flexible, more responsive, not have to go through the corporate processes. So please don't think that not being a huge global organisation has to be a barrier, because actually in some cases that can be an advantage. So talking about recruitment. So our message is not that you should employ disabled people, but why on earth would you want to exclude a significant part of your talent pool? Why would you want to have processes that exclude someone who could actually be the very best candidate for your job? And that's where we're coming from in all of this. So it makes sense to reach the broadest possible talent pool. And in the UK, I'm very encouraged that a lot of our members are really starting to think like that, possibly because of the very high levels of employment generally. So the first stage is attraction. If you want to recruit disabled people, where are you advertising? What kind of language are you using? What kind of imagery are you using? What does your brand look like? Will it resonate with your audience? Will it make a disabled person think, this organisation wants someone like me? This is an organisation where someone like me is welcome and valued. And that's really very important across the piece. So you could have a wonderful advert that is all about being positive about disability and nice case studies. If you then have other organisational messages and images that undermine that, then you're not going to get anywhere. And the example I always use around this is that if you have a campaign in your organisation around mental health, say, and it being good to talk, and you have posters around that, if next to that is a poster promoting an Ironman challenge, you're kind of undermining your effort. And then there's some really practical things around making sure that your advert is accessible. Can you offer information in other formats? Can you make it as easy as possible for as many people to apply? There's also a really important step about thinking about the person you're looking for. We've all been in the position where someone in our teams has said that they're leaving, and we've thought, I can't afford to have that vacancy. I need to fill it like yesterday. So the temptation often for all of us is to dig out the advert we used last time and to dig out the job description and the person specification that we used, have a quick glance over it, think it still looks probably all right, put it back out there. But actually taking that extra step, that extra bit of time to say, you know what, does this job actually need 5 years of experience? Does it actually need that specific qualification? Does it actually need a driving licence? Could it be done differently? And really thinking about what you need to be done through the job, the outcomes, rather than necessarily how it can be done. So there may be jobs that you've never considered could be done part-time or flexibly or using public transport rather than driving, or by someone who perhaps, for whatever reason, hasn't had the chance to get the qualification you usually ask for. There are also lots of specific things that you can do around the recruitment stage, around enabling people to show you how they would do the job rather than tell you about what qualifications they have. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Some of our members are also starting to do blind applications and assessments where the people assessing don't see the name of the person, but in some cases, Barclays does this, for example, they even take off all the qualifications so that they're really focusing on what someone is demonstrating, their skills and their experience are and how they would do the job. So at interview stage, I'm going to come on to adjustments, but the really important thing here, takeaway here, is to ask people about adjustments they need, not whether they have a disability. And this is important right through the piece. So examples of adjustments you might make for recruitment to mean that a disabled candidate can be considered for your job can include communication support, like the fantastic signers that we have over here. It could be easy read information that supports somebody with a learning disability. It could be more time for tests for people with, for example, dyslexia, or you could remove the timed element altogether so that everybody has a level playing field. I met a young graduate quite recently, and she was going through a recruitment process, and she said she had to do a test, and she had dyslexia, and she wasn't sure whether or not to tell them, because on the one hand, she knew that if she didn't tell them, she wouldn't finish the test and she wouldn't do very well. But on the other hand, if she did tell them, would they mark her down because of her dyslexia? Now, hopefully they wouldn't have done, but if they'd removed the timed element, that problem would just be removed. Some of the other things that we see, for example, for people with autism, are providing interview questions in advance. And also unambiguous questions. I was saying to somebody earlier that I have heard numerous stories of it all going terribly wrong for a candidate with autism when they get asked, tell me about yourself. And that can then lead to either, and this is true, talking about all the things that somebody thinks are wrong with them, or talking about things that have nothing to do with the job, or a kind of blow-by-blow account of everything that's happened since they were born. And these are all real examples. Whereas actually, if you ask the question, that's what you really want to know, which is, why do you want this job? Or, why do you think that you'd be good at this job? You're likely to get a much better answer. The last point on those little bullet points I've got there is work trials. So many jobs that we all do, possibly excluding this one, you don't need to be able to talk about what you can do, you just need to be able to do it. So having work trials that mean that somebody can show you how they do a job rather than talking about how they might do it can make a huge difference, and also mean that you get a better candidate, because you get a candidate who is good at doing the job you need, not necessarily so good at selling themselves. And the whole piece around adjustments as well, if you're going to ask candidates if they need adjustments, the crucial thing is that you are able to respond to it, and that the manager who is asking has the confidence to respond. And this is a true story. I heard a story from a recruitment agency who told me about an experience of a hiring manager who had an email from a candidate coming to interview to say, I need an adjustment. And the hiring manager panicked and said, oh my God, this candidate needs an adjustment, went to their manager. The manager panicked, they went to HR, and so on. And eventually somebody said, what's the adjustment? And no one had asked, because nobody wanted to offend and nobody wanted to do the wrong thing. And they went all the way back down the chain, and it turned out that this candidate had a visual impairment and had a guide dog and wanted to know if there was somewhere that her guide dog could sit during the interview and have a drink of water. And it was as basic as that. On which note, I'm very sorry not to see Archie Robin, because I know that because he sings, doesn't he, when people clap, which is really very enjoyable. So it's really about the confidence to be able to do these things, to ask and then to respond. In work, getting adjustments in place from when someone starts, so it sounds absolutely obvious, but what can happen is that a disabled candidate is appointed and then nothing happens and they turn up on day one, and guess what? If they need a bit of kit or whatever it is they need, it isn't there, and that's awkward for them in feeling they can't do the job. It's difficult in explaining it to co-workers, so getting things ready in advance. I know as well that whether people say it or not, they often worry about the cost. So remember that many adjustments that you would make for a disabled employee are actually free. So soft adjustments include things like flexible working for people who would struggle to get on a train in rush hour, whether that's due to wheelchair access or the fact that they experience extreme anxiety, sitting in a quiet space, different lighting, and of course then there are the sort of technical and kit adjustments, some of the things that Robin talked about, which are truly life-changing, but much more mainstream now and not necessarily expensive. So things like speech-to-text software, AI, and even specific things like sit-stand desks. I also want to say at the bottom that when we talk about giving advice to organisations, we focus very much on practical solutions, and though we might start with the best practice, working out what's actually workable for your organisation may be different. So an example I've got on the slide there is the Metropolitan Police. They contacted our advice service and they said they had a member of staff who was experiencing acute anxiety in a very noisy office to the extent it was becoming very problematic for them doing their job. And our best practice advice was, could they sit in a separate office or at least a very quiet area? And they said to us, well, actually, this is a police incident room. this isn't possible. So we worked through it, and the answer that we ended up coming up with was to get a very good pair of quality noise-cancelling headphones, and that did the trick. Retention is obviously another huge area and very important. So once you've recruited this talent, why would you want to lose it? But also going back to some of the stats earlier, most disabilities are acquired. And we're all working longer. I think in the UK it's something like 150 now that we've got to work to. So why would you want to risk losing people who are older because they've acquired a disability? So again, it's about making it easy for people to ask for what they need. And also something for managers to be able to look beyond the obvious and think that something else may be going on. And you'll be surprised how often our advice service gets calls from managers who are starting a performance process with an employee who isn't paying attention in meetings, for example, and it turns out that they are actually concealing the fact that they are losing their hearing, but they're too embarrassed to tell you. Equally, we hear a lot about people with undiagnosed dyslexia. So really having that sort of thought, hang on a minute, is something else happening? Also, if someone is coping, does it matter if you don't know? And I will say to that, where is somebody's energy going? If you're focusing on the job, you can focus on the job if you're not having to worry about your disability or about mentioning the fact that perhaps you have medical appointments or that you need to take medication at work or anything like that. So the adjustments process is really important, as is getting the language right. Too often we use negative language around disability, so disclose or declare. It sounds like something you'd say about a criminal record, and very often on application forms, it's next to the bit about a criminal record. Whereas actually if you ask people about what adjustments they need, or even if you ask them to tell you what support they need rather than disclose, that make a big difference. And the other thing to say as well is that we are seeing an increasing number of organisations offering things like flexible working and productivity tools for anybody in their workforce, which removes the need for people to tell you why they need it and removes the stigma. Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast. This slide is a picture of Peter Drucker, who came up with that famous quote, "I wish I had," and it is absolutely true. You can have the best policies in the world, but if your culture doesn't support and truly value disabled colleagues and employees, it's going to fall at the first hurdle. So it's got to be led from the top, and it's got to be backed up by managers and colleagues all through the organisation, knowing where to go for support, having the confidence to have the conversation and believing that it's the right thing to do, not just ethically for the business. I was asked just to finish with a few examples of who's getting it right in football. So firstly, Liverpool Football Club in the UK. They are doing a lot around accessibility. We have our own Disability Smart Awards, which are hotly contested, coming up next week, and they are finalists in that, and they provide a whole load of information around accessibility on their web pages and loads of information on their stands. That's more on the customer piece than the employee piece. This one, I didn't know Amy was an Everton fan, so hopefully this is good news. Everton Football Club was the first UK club to achieve disability confident employer status, which is the government scheme, and obviously is around employment. Arsenal, I'm sorry to say, Amy, went one better and got level 3, which is leader status, but hey. And encouragingly, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission research last year found that the Premier League, there were huge improvements around accessibility right across the piece. So the Premier League is really starting to wake up and do this. And my message to you all is that we can all do this. It doesn't have to be difficult. So why not? Let's do it. And if you'd like more information, those are our contact details on the screen, and I think that those will be circulated after the event, but please do get in touch. And if you're not a member, obviously, we would love you to join us. Thank you.